Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta-story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective.
Hi there! I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 41, the ADHD disconnection. This topic got added to the Body Disconnection series by surprise. A recent conversation with a friend about ADHD made me realize that ADHD can be a cause for disconnection from the body, and that disconnection from the body can worsen symptoms of ADHD, which obviously fits right in with what we've been talking about since the episode titled Our Two Selves. So let's dive in. I haven't really talked about ADHD on this podcast before, though I think I've acknowledged on air that I have it. This is because 1 year after diagnosis and 6 months after accepting it as legit, I'm still synthesizing theories and informations about ADHD. There will be other episodes about it eventually. For now, I'm going to offer an overview of why it's hard to get a handle on and how that intersects with the internal experience of one's physical body. First, there is still not a clear understanding of what ADHD even is in the sense of its root cause. The symptoms used to diagnose it are fairly clear, but they don't touch the why. And interventions tend to be aimed at behavioral adjustments. In a cynical mood, I say that interventions seek to return someone to bare functionality and don't care about genuine well-being. In a more generous mood, I say that the medical model struggles with complexity, and this is why it struggles with ADHD. Because ADHD is innately complex. Whatever the root cause, by the time it presents with diagnosable symptoms, especially if someone is adult diagnosed, the condition is biological, neurological, and psychological. All three of these forces interact in the system of the person with ADHD and contribute to the symptoms in primary and/or secondary ways. Primary factors directly contribute to ADHD symptoms. Secondary factors might reinforce ADHD symptoms caused by primary factors or mimic factors, or create a second layer of symptoms caused by the direct symptoms. That probably sounds really abstract, so let me ground it in an example. A primary factor of poor working memory leads to a symptom of forgetfulness. The ADHD caused the poor working memory. The forgetfulness was the observable ADHD symptom. A secondary symptom might be anxiety about forgetting. The anxiety is not caused by the ADHD per se, but is a natural and predictable side effect that arose due to repeated failures or punishments for that forgetfulness, which was caused directly by the ADHD. So, in looking at a condition that involves the neural structures of the brain, the nervous system throughout the body, the biological needs of the body, such as fuel and energy production, the bioavailable hormones and neurotransmitters in the body, and psychological forces like emotional associations, subconscious belief paradigms, those pesky inner narratives I'm always talking about, and self-talk, it quickly becomes obvious why there isn't a simple solution. There isn't just one lever that you can pull to get a change, which is why pills often don't work. Like, even if they offer more ability to regulate focus and, for example, remember things, there are life skills involved too, plus ingrained habits and belief structures and emotional associations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all of which would have to be dismantled for effective resolution of ADHD symptoms, or maybe just effective management of them. Effective ADHD therapy is more like if you change 20 different things by 5%, you'll get a different emergent experience of self and life. but no one thing is the thing that makes the difference, if that makes sense. I started looking into ADHD about 4 years ago when a colleague of mine was diagnosed, and the symptoms off of which she was diagnosed sounded an awful lot like me. But as I kept looking at it and trying to pull it apart, I really couldn't tell how it was different from things like complex trauma, chronic nervous system activation, and being artistic, creative, gifted, intuitive in the MBTI sense, like all of these things that might just lead you to prioritize different things and then have that different set of priorities get pathologized. And I'm honestly still not sure where the lines are between each of those categorizations and ADHD, nor am I sure if ADHD is innately problematic or only problematic in specific cultural contexts. About the only objective information that I found at first was it has to do with dopamine disruption. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that motivates us, excites us, and energizes us to take action on literally anything, including getting out of bed. And that is still true. It's very much a part of the ADHD profile. Beyond that, I'm still not sure what parts of the profile are primary factors and which ones are secondary factors. But something that has become glaringly obvious is that many of the more distressing aspects of ADHD actually come from the secondary factors. In other words, the way people with ADHD interpret their symptoms and behaviors causes more distress than the behaviors themselves, which creates a self-reinforcing loop of negative self-talk, negative experience of self, and worsening outcomes due to this ever-increasing negative self-perception, which leads to pressuring yourself to be different or better or other or perfect, and a sense of failure and inadequacy when that inevitably doesn't happen. So, what are some examples of this? Well, here's a few common ADHD symptoms that, in my view, are secondary rather than primary. Rejection sensitivity. That sounds an awful lot like a learned behavior from being overcorrected and punished for one's authentic existence over and over and over again, starting in childhood. Demand avoidance. That sounds like a visceral rejection of being controlled or asked to give more than one has capacity for, because that has happened too many times in the past, over and over and over again since early childhood. Going into a fugue state where it's not just poor working memory and poor short-term memory, but genuine, like, blankness, like it didn't even happen. Well, that's a common experience when your nervous system is in a chronic state of low-level activation or hypervigilance to threats. Speaking of threats, seeing chores, tasks, other people as threats, that's a predictable side effect to nervous system overstimulation or chronic physical exhaustion. Crawling out of your skin with boredom and seeking any kind of relief or distraction, a natural response to understimulation or underengagement with the present moment and environment. That's not even a human thing. Think of anxious pets who overgroom, or if you've ever been to a zoo and seen a big cat that just paces and paces and paces its enclosure. It's seeking sensory enrichment because the environment is not stimulating enough. One of my friends actually compares ADHD to being one of those expensive dog breeds that have a very narrow window of tolerance for living conditions, or they get neurotic. And that's actually pretty true to my experience, although I can kind of only see it in a before-after sense. Before I started getting reconnected with my body and managing myself better, I actually thought I functioned well enough and could tolerate a whole lot of miserable conditions. And I could, as long as I was dissociated from my body. Once I stopped, it was like, oh no, I am decidedly not thriving in these fast-paced conditions. And while it might be frustrating to have to continually self-manage myself like I'm a neurotic show poodle, that is the body that I have, and I can either embrace that or make myself more miserable than I have to. So I hope that it's easy for you to see how the internal body experience of someone with ADHD can become so hostile to the conscious mind. If the self that is keeps getting flooded with sensory overload, feelings of emptiness, the sting of rejection, or the fear of punishment, why would the self that acts stay present when it can withdraw from the body? Those sensations are uncomfortable. If they are also inescapable, either due to the person not knowing how to alleviate them or not being able to without a worse consequence from society, of course the mind is going to seek to escape the body. It's the only way to survive. And if one has cut off the subtle flow of information from the body, then you're only going to hear the really loud distress signals for things like hunger, thirst, fatigue, hurt. Unfortunately, by the time a signal has gotten that loud, we hear it when it's too late to prevent distress. At that point, we can only manage distress. And the more time the body spends in distress, the less time the conscious mind wants to spend inhabiting that body, because a distressed body is an uncomfortable body. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. But wait, there's more. I told you, ADHD is complex. There is also a mental fatigue aspect. And mental fatigue also feels really bad in the body. It's hard to tolerate physically, and it creates conditions where you're watching yourself do things you don't like while having no capacity to stop yourself. Basically, it's what happens when the self that acts has worn out its energy for the day, but there is still day left. And you spend that time with essentially no one at the helm. It's just pure impulses and whims. The concept of willpower fatigue is kind of what I'm talking about here. That's pretty well established. Basically, it means that people only have so many good decisions in a day. That is, decisions which require us to deliberately work against some inner impulse or instinct or desire. A kid who has been restraining emotions all day at school in order to behave properly according to the classroom rules, for example, might come home and melt down. That's because they are just tapped out on self-regulatory decisions, those, quote, good decisions. People with ADHD have more sensory input coming in that they have to filter out. Staying on task against sounds and movements in the environment, thoughts that arise in response to stimuli around them, and their own propensity to daydream means that they are having to make more of those good decisions than a non-ADHD person does in the course of a day. Someone with ADHD can only redirect their attention so many times or resist so many temptations before they run out of the ability to do it. That's not an ADHD thing, that's a human thing. It just happens sooner to people with ADHD because we have to resist more distractions. So in essence, that self that acts wears itself out sooner, trying to control more aspects of the self that is than is going to be true for someone who does not have ADHD. Another aspect of ADHD is the dopamine disruptions. Either ADHD brains need more dopamine, produce less of it, have fewer dopamine receptor sites, or have idiosyncratic dopamine release and response patterns, or some combination of any or all of the above. Therefore, they need more energy and or willpower to perform tasks of daily life if those tasks don't release dopamine for them the way they do for other people. And that can make life itself feel like a torturous slog just to survive. And if half of your day feels actively like a punishment, why on earth would you stay present to it? Why would your self that acts choose to stay with the self that is in that context? It doesn't make any sense. It would feel so bad. So, for those of you out there who have ADHD, there are very real and predictable reasons for you to have disconnected somewhat or almost entirely from your physical body, from that self that is. Additionally, a compounding problem for those of us with ADHD is this. When we stop being able to make good decisions, we will often plummet all the way into a ridiculous deficit because of the way bad decisions quickly pile up. The choice not to work out when your body's craving stimulation, for example, might lead to grabbing cookies for stimulation instead, and that leads to a sugar crash, and that leads to an unbalanced or unhealthy panic dinner, and then that leads to staying up way past your bedtime for no real good reason. And the next day comes and it finds you exhausted from insufficient sleep. You're kind of bloated and inflamed, but nutritionally depleted. So you're also physically low on energy. And then on kind of an emotional level, you're angry and ashamed at yourself for all of those bad choices yesterday. And you're just kind of generally struggling before you even get out of bed. Like on a day like that, do you have any good decisions available at all, much less enough to get back on track and climb out of that deficit? And this is also why ADHD can be such a downward spiral. Like the worse your symptoms are, the worse your symptoms get because the harder it becomes to self-manage. The irony is that making good decisions is easier, as in they take less energy, when the need is just beginning instead of when it's hitting crisis levels. So this means that the least taxing time to make good decisions about body care and energy management is when the signals of need from your body are still subtle, when they're whispers instead of screams. Which means that being fully embodied is actually one of the best ways to combat and manage your ADHD symptoms, even though, as we've already established, having ADHD can so easily create conditions that drive us out of touch with our bodies. So ADHD and the self that is essentially have this amplifying effect on each other. Either you were tuned in, listening earlier, making good decisions sooner that both preserve energy and create more energy, or you're tuned out and losing more energy in order to conserve less energy, thereby creating more distress and thus more reason to tune out. It's vicious. It's a spiral either way. It's just, are you going up or are you going down? So if you're one of my ADHD homies listening, I hope that overview of how these pieces fit together helps you give yourself some grace. Life is harder with ADHD. It does get louder and hurt more and cost more resources. And if you're listening and resonating despite not having ADHD, there might be a reason for that. And no, it's not that you need to go get diagnosed. Actually, modern life is running everyone's health into the ground by encouraging all of us to do these detrimental behaviors. Run short on sleep, force our focused attention onto too many things in a day, and never give ourselves real downtime or rest periods. Limit our physical movement, overemphasize processed carbs and sugar in our diet, and underemphasize protein and nutrient-dense foods like vegetables. The reason, quote unquote, everyone is a little bit ADHD now is because our lifestyle in modern America literally creates conditions for our bodies to exhibit all of those behaviors due to being constantly stressed out and nutritionally depleted. So, you might be asking at this point, what specifically does one do about this tangle of biology, neurology, and psychology? What are those edges to sand down to actually make a helpful change? In other words, what are those 20 levers you talked about? How do I start pulling them? All right, high level on this. Because it's actually a topic we're going to come back to and cover in detail and in depth in a different episode. But to answer the burning question for today, on the biological side, factors with a big impact are sleep, nutrition, and exercise. On the neurological side, nervous system activation or potentially even dysregulation, which is where you're not effectively able to move in and out of a stress activation or a rest and true relaxation state according to the environmental conditions. If you're just stuck in one or the other, that's dysregulation. So yeah, activation in general, if it's happening too much all the time, or dysregulation where you're stuck either in a freeze response or kind of a flight response, are generally going to have a big impact on the severity of your symptoms. And on the psychological side, big reinforcers for ADHD symptoms are critical or negative self-talk and having a negative internal narrative about yourself. And again, even for the people who don't actually have ADHD, but are just victims of modernity, these are all the same levers to pull to adjust how your self that is feels from the inside. It's just exaggerated in ADHD systems. What I told my friend to start with, and what I would suggest you start with if you're wanting to make some changes, is actually the physical factors. In this context, both the biological and neurological aspects would be physical. And this was my advice for a couple of reasons. First, there really isn't much point attempting to do psychological belief restructuring if your body is in an active stress response due to being physically under-resourced. The changes likely won't stick, and even if they do, you won't feel that much better because your body would still be exhausted and running on empty. So get your body into a state where that's not the problem, and you'll be more effective at making psychological belief structure, emotional beliefs kind of changes. Second, the physical lifestyle changes are a lot more measurable and trackable. You can pretty easily note how much you sleep and what kind of quality it is based on whether you wake up tired. And you can track what you eat and observe what kind of eating patterns you have, like when you eat during the day and what order you eat your foods in. You can track how much you move or don't move. So that tangibility makes these really low-hanging fruit that you can use to gain momentum for the harder stuff. Like you start making these changes that are really obvious to see and feel, and that reassures you that, oh, you are capable of doing something differently. You are capable of making a change. And in addition, if you haven't been taking good care of yourself physically, starting to do that is going to give you more resources for tackling the more deep and subtle issues that come next. Third, and perhaps most importantly, treating your body to proper care and feeding will resolve any issues that are strictly from your lifestyle, and that gives you more clarity about what the actual problems are. And while that might be kind of frustratingly high level and doesn't totally feel like an answer, I am going to stop here for today because the main point I wanted to make with this episode was that ADHD and disconnection from the body amplify and reinforce each other. Resolving it on a physical level is a full episode or more, all on its own. And that resolving process happens to be the last topic I have planned for this series of episodes anyway, because the process is the same for all of us living disconnected from our bodies and in chronically stressed states of being, whether it's in part because of ADHD or not. So if you haven't already, subscribe to me on whatever podcast platform you like, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Podbean app, whatever. That way you get the next episodes when they publish. Especially important now that my schedule has become so erratic. We're going to blame grad school. It's a thing. Also, full disclosure, if you're picking up with this episode and wanting to immediately jump into some solutions, I'm taking a break from this series for episode 42. This should be for obvious reasons if you're, like me, any kind of science fiction nerd, and thus the Body Disconnection and Resolution series will pick up with episode 43. That is all for this week. Thank you so much for being here and choosing to spend this time with me. If you want to know more about my work as a coach, go to thepatternbreaker.com. You can check out my Patreon, patreon.com/narrative responsibility, to help my community and this podcast grow and thrive. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?